So the second of our 8 insights from across our series of 10 country case studies of elections in 2024 was that a frustration with political representation often leads to violence. So what I mean by this is that we've seen and violence has been part of election and political processes, and this has been a concern for quite a long time. In many of the contexts we studied, there have been high levels of political violence for a while. And in some of the other contexts, more in the global north context, we're seeing rises of violence around elections and around politicized violence, which is very worrying to people in these contexts. And what we saw across our case studies is you can attribute much of this to a frustration with political representation. That when people are able to achieve what they want to achieve, whether this is democratic, transparent, for equality, or whether this is something that is, really anti-democratic, exclusionary, authoritarian. When it is possible to achieve that without violence, through the existing levers of political power, that people will choose to take that route. And so that we see this violence erupting when there is an inability to achieve one's aims through existing political processes. We see this violence erupting both in terms of political violence and politicized violence. So political violence being more targeting elected representatives, election workers, perhaps the institutions and processes of these elections. And then politicized violence being violence directed against minority groups or potentially institutions or businesses, but that have been politicized by narratives within those elections, within that political communication. And we saw that in our country context where there was robust control or reasonably robust control over violence within the country, through the state, through the judiciary, through police, that this frustration with political representation leading to violence tended to take extra institutional channels. So this is civic groups coming together in violent protests against, attacks against minorities. And in countries where there was much less robust control by the state, institutional bodies of violence within the country, that this violence tended to erupt in terms of more intra-elite violence to control the levers and the processes of political power. Pakistan seemed like a really interesting case in terms of this insight, where we had several examples of how political violence was erupting to do with frustrations with political representation. Tell me about some of the ways in which that manifested in Pakistan.
So in a country like Pakistan, electoral violence can be observed broadly through two ways or two lenses. First is a structural lens within which the military tries to consistently interfere in the elections, often successfully, and towards a certain result eventually. And we saw this in these past elections too, when they cracked down against the PTI, Imran Khan's party, and put him behind bars, possibly on trumped-up charges, and banned the party from contesting the elections as a party. It eventually didn't work because, as we saw, that the independents backed by the PTI won most of the seats. So yeah, in a structural way, the Pakistani military often exhibits violent tendencies towards the electoral process. And the second way in which electoral violence manifests in Pakistan is very direct. There are insurgent groups, for example, who are frustrated with a certain political system within Pakistan, and they try to bring about a change in this political system through direct, explicit electoral violence, targeting voter booths, targeting voters, targeting political candidates. Often these are deadly attacks against political workers, political party leaders, and political infrastructure. So in the past election, at least 30 people were killed on the election day in multiple blasts within Pakistan. And so yeah, we can see that in addition to the military's structural violence, there are militant groups who try to bring about a change in the political system, whether they be, for example, the groups like the insurgent groups based in Balochistan or KPK, who want greater political representation or greater economic resources or less control of the federal government. But there are other groups, for example, the local chapter of ISIS, who would want like a fundamental change in the whole political system of the country. And then they resort to violence against what they see in many ways as an illegitimate exercise in the form of elections. Two broad ways in which electoral violence manifests in Pakistan.
So this insight of ours in terms of the frustration of political representation leading to violence, and this being different within kind of states that have robust control over violence within the country compared to states that don't. How did this manifest in Germany, a country where presumably there's reasonably robust control over violence within the country?
So sadly, Germany is quite a good example of what we've been talking about for the global north countries. We've seen an increase in the last year of both political and politicized violence within the country. 2023 saw both the highest number of attacks against asylum seekers within the country since 2016, as well as 2024 seeing the most amount of attacks against elected political representatives within the country. So we need to understand where this violence is really coming from. What is this frustration that we've noticed in Germany? And I think if we're taking politicized violence, this is towards marginalized groups, then what we really see is the increase in extremist rhetoric and ideologies online is leading to these increasing attacks. And what we're seeing, this frustration as we understand it, is that it is people who want a fundamentally different demographic within their country and want a fundamentally different political system which they're not getting represented at the moment. And this is an expression of this politicized violence, that they can't achieve this through the current constitutional order, and so this violence is an expression of that frustration. And importantly, as we made this distinction, this violence is non-institutional, so this is coming from actors outside the state directed towards other groups. On the other hand, when we're talking about political violence towards political representatives, what we're seeing is actors who want a fundamental change to the makeup of the German political landscape. An attack on a political candidate is a fundamental attack on their legitimacy and on their right to express themselves. So these attacks can be understood as an attempt to prevent this form of political representation. But what we're saying is, to understand where this radicalization is coming from, you first have to understand the underlying frustrations which are leading to people to think outside the terms of the current political system as it exists in Germany.
Mozambique and the Mozambique election seems like it was a particularly interesting example of this insight that we saw across our case studies with the frustration of political representation leading to violence. Tell me a little bit more about how this played out in the context of the 2024 election in Mozambique.
Okay, so Mozambique is unfortunately a paradigmatic case of frustration with political representation leading to violence. Frelimo have been in control of Mozambique ever since independence in 1975, since elections were held, since the peace agreement with Renamo, which once a militia group in 92, and they won every single election with a kind of sniff from the international community of tampering. But generally, they've been considered to be the winners. This year, it's a little bit different. So this year, the EU and the US and international observers have suggested that more substantial vote rigging occurred. And Venetia Monlando, who's the primary opposition in the absence of Renamo, whose vote collapsed at the last election, claims that their parallel vote counts that he won with about 50% of the votes. What happens immediately afterwards is that Daniel Chapo is announced as the formal winner of the election. He's the Frelimo candidate with 70% of the vote. So there's this huge disparity between the parallel count and the official count. Monlande demands that his supporters rally to Maputo, the capital, and to protest. Frelimo then attempt to sue Monlande for any damages that occur on the basis that he encouraged riots. He has to flee the country, and 2 days after he flees, or 3 days after he flees, they announce Daniel Chapo is going to be the president. The Constitutional Court upholds the controversial results. There were attacks on protesters in the in this space of about 2.5 weeks, there's just consistent attacks on protesters. Journalists were injured, journalists were arrested. Some of these journalists were caught up in this, were reporting on Frelimo-controlled newspapers and radio as well. So no one was spared the violence and confusion immediately afterwards. And it's just a sorry sight, because it all comes down to this idea that we've got this young, dynamic population that are looking for progressive change in their country, and ostensibly their democratic process has collapsed to the point where now it's really uncertain in both the international community's eyes and, of course, local Mozambicans, like who represents them at all in this process.